Captain Jake Morrison stood in the grand diplomatic chamber aboard the neutral space station, and he had seen many things in his life as a soldier and explorer, but nothing quite prepared him for this moment, and the chamber itself was massive with walls that seemed to shimmer with some kind of alien technology, and the ceiling stretched so high above that it disappeared into a soft, glowing mist, and strange symbols floated in the air around them, pulsing with light that hurt his eyes if he stared too long. The human delegation had arrived 3 days ago, and they came with hope and good intentions. And Earth had sent its best people to make first contact with the Eldrath Empire, and Jake was chosen because of his military record and his ability to stay calm under pressure. And Ambassador Kate Sullivan stood beside him, along with several scientists and cultural experts, and they all wore their dress uniforms, looking professional and respectful. Princess Lyria entered the chamber, and the entire atmosphere changed, and she was tall and elegant, with skin that had a faint silver glow, and her hair flowed down her back like liquid starlight, and her eyes were violet, and they seemed to see right through a person, and her ears came to delicate points, adorned with crystals that hummed softly, and she wore robes of silver and blue that moved as if alive. And behind her walked her guards in ornate armor that looked both ancient and advanced. But it was the creature behind her that made everyone stop breathing, and Azarath the dragon was beyond description, and the beast was enormous with scales that shimmered blue like the deepest ocean and wings that folded against its back, were each larger than a human spacecraft, and its eyes burned, with intelligence that felt older than stars, and the dragon moved with grace, despite its size, and every step it took made the floor vibrate slightly. Jake had prepared for this meeting for months, and he studied Eldrath culture and learned their customs and practiced their greetings, and he understood that this was the most important moment in human history, and if this went well, humanity would join the galactic community, and if it went badly, Earth might face war or isolation, and so he stepped forward with confidence and bowed in the Eldrath fashion. Princess Lyria looked at him, and her expression was cold, and she did not return the bow, and instead she stood there studying the humans like one might study insects under glass, and the silence stretched on, and it became uncomfortable, and Jake straightened up and waited for her to speak. When she finally did speak, her voice was musical, but the words cut like knives, and she said that humanity was primitive, and she called them barbarians from a backwater world, and she said that Earth barely understood space travel, and that humans fought among themselves over simple resources, when the galaxy offered everything, and she asked why the Eldrath Empire should acknowledge creatures so beneath them. The other human delegates shifted nervously, and Kate Sullivan looked shocked, and her mouth opened to respond. But Jake raised his hand slightly, and she stopped, and he understood what was happening here. And this young princess was testing them, and she wanted to see how humans would react to insults, and if they would rage or beg or try to justify themselves. Jake had fought in wars across the solar system, and he survived battles that killed thousands, and he united colonies that hated each other, and he negotiated with pirates and warlords and corrupt politicians, and he learned long ago that some people only respected strength, and that sometimes the strongest response was no response at all. Princess Lyria continued speaking, and she said that the Eldrath Empire had ruled the stars for 5,000 years, and that they possessed magic and technology beyond human comprehension, and she gestured to Azurath and said that dragons, like her companion, had wisdom older than human civilization, and she said that perhaps in another 1,000 years, humanity might be worth speaking to, but not today. The dragon Azurath watched Jake with those ancient eyes, and the creature said nothing, but something passed between them in that moment, and it was as if the dragon was measuring him, and Jake met that gaze without fear and without anger, and he simply looked back with calm acceptance. Jake knew what he had to do, and it went against every diplomatic protocol, and it would shock his own people, and it might even start a war. But he also knew that if he let this insult stand, then humanity would always be seen as lesser, and they would be treated as children or pets, and that was unacceptable. So Captain Jake Morrison did something that no one expected, and he looked at Princess Lyria one more time, and his face showed nothing, and no anger, and no hurt, and no surprise, and just complete calm. And then he turned around and started walking toward the exit. Kate Sullivan gasped, and she called out to him, and she said his name with urgency. But Jake did not stop, and his boots made echoing sounds on the polished floor, and the sound seemed loud in the sudden silence, and the other human delegates looked at each other in confusion, and some started to follow him, but others stayed frozen in place. Princess Lyria stood there, and her expression changed from smug superiority to shock, and no one had ever walked away from her before. And in Eldrath culture, turning away from royalty without permission was unthinkable. And she opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out, and her hands clenched at her sides. Azurath the dragon lifted its massive head, and the creature watched Jake walk away with what might have been interest, and the dragon's thoughts were its own. But something flickered in those ancient eyes, and it was almost like recognition, or perhaps respect. Jake walked through the doorway, and he did not look back, and he did not hurry, and he just walked at a normal, steady pace like a man who had made a decision and would not change his mind, and the door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and he was gone. The diplomatic chamber erupted in noise, and the Eldrath guards spoke rapidly in their musical language, and the human delegates argued among themselves, and Kate Sullivan looked torn between following Jake and trying to salvage the situation, and some of the scientists looked terrified because they understood what this meant. Princess Lyria finally found her voice, and she demanded to know what just happened, and she asked if this was some kind of human custom, and her advisors had no answers, and they had studied humanity, but nothing in their research prepared them for this, and one elder advisor said that perhaps the human was overwhelmed by her presence, and another suggested that maybe humans did not understand proper protocol. But Azurath made a deep rumbling sound that might have been laughter, and the dragon spoke for the first time, and its voice entered their minds rather than their ears, and it said that the human understood perfectly and that his action was deliberate, and that he chose to walk away, and the dragon said something else too, and it said that perhaps they had made a mistake. Princess Lyria felt something she rarely experienced, and it was doubt. And she had expected the humans to argue or apologize, or try to prove their worth. And instead, their leader simply left. And he rejected her, and rejected the empire. That was not supposed to happen, and for the first time in her, a young life, she wondered if she had miscalculated. Kate Sullivan made a decision, and she bowed deeply to the princess, and apologized for any offense, and she tried to explain that Captain Morrison was under great stress, and that he meant no disrespect, and she asked for another chance to restart the negotiations, and her voice was professional, but inside she was panicking because she knew that Jake had just thrown away months of preparation. But Princess Lyria was not listening anymore, and she was still staring at the door where Jake had disappeared, and something about his calm rejection bothered her more than any angry response would have, and she dismissed the human delegation with a wave of her hand, and told them to leave, and she would consider whether to give them another audience. The humans filed out quietly, and they found Jake waiting in the corridor outside, and he stood there with his arms crossed, looking completely composed, and Kate walked up to him, and her face was red with anger, and she demanded to know what he was thinking, and the other delegates gathered around wanting answers. Jake looked at them all, and he said simply that the princess wanted to see them as inferior, and that anything they said would only confirm her belief, and he said that by walking away, he showed her that humanity would not beg for acceptance, and that they had dignity and pride, and that if the Eldrath Empire wanted an alliance, it would be between equals or not at all. Some of the delegates understood, and others thought he was crazy, and one scientist said that Jake might have just started a war, and Jake nodded and said that was possible, but that living on their knees was not an option, and that humanity had not clawed its way to the stars just to bow before the first empire they met. Kate Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked what they should do now, and Jake said they would return to Earth and report what happened, and let the Eldrath Empire make the next move. And he said that if Lyria was as smart as she thought she was, then she would realize her mistake, and if not, then humanity would deal with whatever came next. They returned to their ship and left the station, and as they flew back toward Earth, Jake stood at the observation window, looking out at the stars, and he knew that he had gambled everything on a single moment, and he bet that silence, dignity would speak louder than words, and only time would tell if he was right. Back on the station, Princess Lyria stood in her private chambers, and Azurath coiled nearby, and she paced back and forth trying to understand what had happened, and the dragon watched her with patient eyes, and finally, she asked the dragon what it thought of the human captain. Azurath was quiet for a while, and then the dragon said that Jake Morrison was dangerous, and not because of weapons or ships, but because he understood something important, and he understood that respect cannot be demanded, and it must be earned. And the dragon said that by walking away he had done something the Empire had not seen in centuries, and he had challenged them. Princess Lyria asked if she had made a mistake, and Azurath did not answer directly, and instead the dragon asked her what she felt when the human looked at her, and she thought about it and realized that she felt nothing from him, and no fear, and no awe, and no desire to please her, and just calm indifference, and it unnerved her. The dragon said that perhaps it was time for the Empire to remember that age and power were not the same as wisdom, and that humanity might be young, but they were not weak, and Lyria felt anger rise in her chest, and she said that she would show these humans their place, and that the Empire would teach them respect. But even as she said it, she felt uncertain, and the image of Jake Morrison turning away without a word stayed in her mind, and she could not shake it, and something told her that this was not over, and that her insult had started something that would change everything. 3 months had passed since the failed diplomatic meeting, and in that time, everything changed. The Eldrath Empire made its decision, and Princess Lyria convinced the High Council that humanity needed to be taught a lesson, and they agreed that these young upstart humans should learn their place in the galaxy, and so the Empire prepared for war. The first target was a human colony on a planet called Kepler 442b, and it was a farming world with about 2 million people, and the Empire expected an easy victory, and they sent a fleet of 30 warships, which was considered more than enough, and the Eldrath military had crushed larger civilizations with less. Princess Lyria commanded the operation from her flagship, the Starfire Crown, and she wanted to personally oversee the humbling of humanity, and Azurath was with her as always, and the dragon seemed quieter than usual, and when Lyria asked if something was wrong, Azurath said only that war always changed things in unexpected ways. The fleet arrived at Kepler 442b, and they sent the standard surrender demand, and the human colonists had 1 hour to evacuate or submit to Eldrath rule, and Lyria expected panic and chaos and quick surrender. But instead, the humans sent back a simple message, and it said that the colony would defend itself and that the Eldrath fleet should leave immediately. Lyria laughed at this, and she thought it was brave but foolish, and she ordered the attack to begin, and the Eldrath warships moved into position, and their weapons charged with ancient power and magic, combined with technology, and they began the bombardment. But something strange happened, and the human defenses were much stronger than expected, and the colony had shields that should not exist, and orbital platforms that fired weapons the Empire had never seen before. And several Eldrath ships took damage in the first exchange, and one destroyer was completely destroyed. General Vareth, who commanded the military forces, reported to Lyria with confusion in his voice, and he said that human resistance was far beyond what intelligence predicted, and he said their tactics were unusual and adaptive, and he requested reinforcements. Lyria refused, and she said that 30 ships should be more than enough for one small colony, and she ordered the general to press the attack, and he obeyed. But over the next few days it became clear that something was very wrong. The humans fought with a desperation and cleverness that shocked the Eldrath warriors, and they used guerrilla tactics in space and hit-and-run attacks, and they seemed to predict every move the Empire made, and what should have been a battle, lasting hours turned into days, and then a week. Azurath observed everything from the command deck, and the dragon said very little, but Lyria could feel concern through their mental bond, and finally, after 5 days of grinding combat, the dragon spoke, and it said that the human defense showed signs of a particular mind at work. Lyria asked what the dragon meant, and Azurath said that the tactics being used bore the mark of Captain Jake Morrison, and that the dragon recognized his strategic pattern, and the way he turned disadvantages into strengths, and Lyria insisted that was impossible because Earth intelligence confirmed that Morrison was nowhere near the front lines. But Azurath was not convinced, and the dragon said that influence did not require physical presence, and that a good commander could shape a battle from across the galaxy through training and preparation and planning, and the dragon said it could smell Morrison in every move the humans made. Lyria pulled up the human military files that her spies had gathered, and she began reading about Jake Morrison properly for the first time, and what she found disturbed her, and his record was extraordinary, and he had fought in something called the Siege of Titan, where he held off an entire rebel fleet with only 3 damaged ships, and no one understood how he survived. There was the miracle of Europa, where Morrison evacuated 2 million colonists under impossible conditions, and he used the moon itself as a weapon and created false readings that confused his enemies and saved countless lives. And then there was the Battle of the Kuiper Belt, where he turned certain defeat into humanity's greatest victory through pure tactical genius. Lyria read report after report, and she began to understand that Captain Jake Morrison was not just a soldier, and he was something more, and he was a legend among his own people, and a man who had never lost a battle when it truly mattered. And she felt cold realization creeping over her. The tactical display on her command deck flashed red, and another Eldrath cruiser was destroyed, and the humans had developed some kind of weapon that turned the Empire shields against themselves, and the technology should not be possible, but there it was. And 5,000 years of military dominance was being challenged by a civilization that had been in space for less than 2 centuries. Communication officer, Mara called out with urgency in her voice, and she said they were receiving a transmission, and that it was from Captain Morrison himself. And Lyria felt her heart race, and she ordered the message to be played. The view screen came to life, and there was Jake Morrison sitting in what looked like a simple military office, and there were no grand displays of power and no theatrical presentations, and he looked exactly as he had 3 months ago, and tired and professional and completely calm. He spoke directly to the camera, and he said, "Princess Lyria," in a neutral tone, and he said that he was sending this message to inform the Eldrath Empire that they had 7 days to withdraw from all human territories, and he said this was not a negotiation but a courtesy, and that it was extended once, because humanity preferred peace to war. Lyria opened her mouth to respond, but the recording continued, and Morrison said that if the Empire refused, they would learn why humanity survived when countless other species fell, and they would learn why humans crawled out of caves and reached for stars despite having no magic and no ancient power, and no dragons to carry them. He paused and looked directly into the camera, and his eyes were hard, and he said that the Empire would learn what it meant to insult humanity. And then the screen went dark. The command deck was silent, and everyone stared at the blank view screen, and Lyria felt multiple emotions at once, and there was anger and fear, and something else that she did not want to name, and it was respect. Azurath rumbled deep in its throat, and the sound filled the chamber, and the dragon mind voice reached Lyria, and it said that perhaps they should have listened instead of spoken, and that the human had given them a warning, and now they would face the consequences. General Vareth reported that human reinforcements were arriving at Kepler 442b, and not just a few ships but entire battle groups, and they came from different human colonies, all converging on the system, and the Empire fleet was now outnumbered. Lyria made a decision, and she ordered the fleet to withdraw temporarily, and they would regroup and bring more forces and crush the humans properly. But even as she gave the order, she knew something had changed, and this was not going to be the easy war she expected. The Eldrath fleet retreated, and they left Kepler 442b behind, and the humans did not pursue, and they simply let the Empire ships go. And this mercy angered Lyria more than an attack would have, because it felt like pity. Over the following weeks, the war spread to multiple systems, and the Eldrath Empire committed more and more resources, and what started as a punitive expedition became a real conflict, and humanity fought back with everything they had. The battles were fierce and brutal, and the Empire had superior technology and magical weapons. But humanity had something else, and they had adaptability and innovation, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. And every engagement taught them something new about their enemy, and they learned faster than anyone thought possible. Lyria found herself studying Jake Morrison obsessively, and she watched recordings of his past battles, and read analyses of his strategies, and tried to understand how his mind worked. And the more she learned, the more she realized her terrible mistake. Morrison never fought the way enemies expected, and he used psychology as much as weapons, and he made opponents second-guess themselves, and he turned their strengths into weaknesses, and he was patient and willing to take losses if it meant winning the larger war. Azurath spoke to her late one night as she sat alone in her chambers, and the dragon said that the Empire had become arrogant over millennia, and that they forgot what it was like to face a truly dangerous enemy. And the dragon said, humanity was dangerous not because of their weapons, but because of their spirit. Lyria asked if the dragon thought they could lose, and Azurath was quiet for a long time before answering, and the dragon said that victory was no longer certain, and that humanity would not surrender easily, and that the cost of defeating them might be higher than the Empire was willing to pay. She asked what they should do, and the dragon suggested opening negotiations again, but Lyria pride would not allow it, and she said that the Empire could not show weakness, and that they must break human resistance, and only then could they talk of peace. The war continued, and months passed, and the Eldrath Empire found itself in a grinding conflict, unlike anything it had faced in recent history, and other alien civilizations watched with growing interest, and some began questioning the Empire supremacy, and others quietly made contact with human diplomats. Battle reports came in daily, and the results were mixed, and the Empire won some fights and lost others, and humanity proved remarkably resilient, and they rebuilt quickly and adapted to every tactic the Empire used, and it was frustrating and alarming. Then came word of a major offensive, and the Empire was planning to attack Proxima Station, and it was a critical supply hub for humanity, and its fall would cripple the human war effort, and Lyria volunteered to lead the assault personally. She gathered a massive fleet, and this time, there would be no mistakes, and they brought their best warriors, and their most powerful ships, and Azurath would fight alongside them, and the dragon reluctance was clear, but the creature remained loyal to Lyria. The fleet arrived at Proxima Station, and the battle began, and it was savage from the first moment, and humans defended the station with everything they had, and the fighting raged in space, and on the station itself, and casualties mounted on both sides. Lyria commanded from the Starfire Crown, and she coordinated the assault and pushed her forces hard and slowly. They gained ground, and it seemed like victory was possible, but then everything changed. A human boarding party breached the Starfire Crown, and Lyria did not understand how, and the ship defenses should have stopped them. But somehow they got through, and alarms blared throughout the vessel, and she heard fighting in the corridors. Azurath was engaged elsewhere, and the dragon was battling a human carrier group and could not return to help, and for the first time, Lyria felt truly vulnerable, and her guards rushed to defend her, but the human soldiers were incredibly skilled. She found herself fighting hand-to-hand in her own corridors, and she was trained in combat, but these humans fought like nothing she had faced, and they were relentless and efficient, and they worked together perfectly, and her guards fell one by one. Finally, the boarding party reached the command deck, and Lyria stood alone facing a dozen human soldiers, and she expected them to kill her. But instead, they lowered their weapons slightly, and a woman in scarred combat armor stepped forward. The woman removed her helmet and revealed a face marked by battle and hard experience, and she said "Princess" in a tired but respectful voice, and she said that Captain Morrison sent a message, and that the war ends today, and one way or another. Lyria looked through the viewport, and saw human vessels surrounding her flagship. And they were not destroying it, but capturing it. And the most advanced warship in the Eldrath fleet was being taken as a prize of war. In that moment, standing on her own command deck as a prisoner, Lyria finally understood, and Jake Morrison had not walked away from the negotiation because he was insulted, and he walked away because he had already seen how the story would end, and he gave her one chance to avoid it, and she threw that chance away. The human commander, whose name was Lisa Hayes, kept her weapon ready, but her finger was off the trigger, and she waited for Lyria's response, and outside the battle continued, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Lyria felt pride crumble inside her, and she realized that she had brought this on herself and on her empire, and that the war could have been avoided if she had simply shown respect. And now, thousands were dead, and her flagship was captured, and humanity had proven they were equals, whether she liked it or not. Capture of Princess Lyria and the Starfire Crown sent shockwaves across the entire galaxy, and news spread quickly through both human and alien networks, and the Eldrath Empire, greatest warship, had been taken intact by the species they called primitive, and the High Council convened an emergency session, and the debates were heated and emotional. Some council members demanded immediate escalation to total war, and they wanted to unleash the full might of the Empire and destroy every human world. And others counseled caution and said that perhaps negotiation was now necessary, and the arguments went on for days while Lyria remained in human custody. Princess Lyria found herself held on a human orbital facility above Earth, and she was treated well and given comfortable quarters. But she was still a prisoner, and guards stood outside her door at all times, and she was allowed to communicate with the Empire, but under human supervision. What surprised her most was when Captain Jake Morrison came to visit, and he arrived alone without guards, and carrying 2 ceramic cups. And he explained that one contained coffee, which was a human beverage, and he thought she might want to try it. He sat across from her in a simple meeting room, and the walls were plain metal, and there were no grand decorations, and nothing like the opulent spaces she was used to. And for a long time, neither of them spoke, and the silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had happened. Jake took a sip from his cup and waited patiently, and he seemed content to sit there forever if necessary. And finally Lyria could not stand it any more, and she broke the silence and asked why he did not destroy her ship when he had every tactical reason to eliminate it. Jake looked at her and his eyes were calm, and he said that this war was never about destruction, and he said it was about respect. And he explained that when she called humanity primitive, she was not entirely wrong, and humans were young and still learning, but they were also survivors. He said that humans learned that respect is not given freely, and it must be earned through action, and that words alone mean nothing. And Lyria felt her throat tighten because she understood what he was saying, and her words at the first meeting had been empty arrogance. She asked if he took her flagship to humiliate the Empire, and Jake shook his head, and he said no, and he said that he took the flagship to show that humans were not prey, and not barbarians to be dismissed, but equals whether the Empire liked it or not. Before Lyria could respond, alarms blared throughout the facility, and Jake communicator crackled to life. And Commander Lisa Hayes' urgent voice filled the room, and she said that long-range sensors detected a massive energy signature approaching, and it was Azurath, and the dragon was coming for the princess alone. Jake stood immediately, and Lyria reached out and gripped his arm, and she said to wait, and she said that Azurath would not attack recklessly, and her bond with the dragon was deep, and she could feel its intention, and it was not here to fight. Jake looked at her skeptically and asked why the dragon would come alone then, and Lyria closed her eyes and reached out through the mystical connection she shared with her ancient companion, and what she felt made her gasp, and she said that Azurath wanted to talk, and specifically to Jake. The meeting took place in open space on a platform hastily constructed between the human facility and where Azurath waited, and the dragon floated in the void, and its massive form was magnificent against the backdrop of stars, and its wings were folded, and it radiated patient ancient power. Jake Morrison stood on the platform in an environmental suit, and Lisa Hayes and Kate Sullivan were with him, and Lyria was there too under guard, and she had never seen her dragon approach anyone but Eldrath with such careful respect, and it unnerved her. Azurath, mental. A voice reached all of them, and it was vast and ancient. And the dragon said that it had lived for 12,000 years, and had seen civilizations rise and fall, and watched empires turn to dust. And in all that time, it rarely witnessed what it saw in humanity. Jake said nothing, and he simply waited for the dragon to continue, and his patience seemed to impress the ancient creature. And Azurath said that Jake was correct, and that respect must be earned, and the dragon said, the Eldrath Empire grew, complacent in its power. The dragon continued and said that the Empire believed age meant superiority, but humanity showed them something they forgot, and that growth comes not from resting on ancient achievements, but from constantly striving forward, and from never accepting limits. Azurath's great head turned toward Lyria, and the dragon mental voice softened, and it said that it had been her companion since she was a child, and that it loved her as it would its own offspring, but that it could not support this war any longer. The dragon said that humanity earned the right to stand as equals among the stars, and to deny this was to deny truth itself, and Lyria felt tears streaming down her face, and she asked if Azurath was abandoning her. The dragon voice filled with warmth, and it said never, and it would always care for her, but it asked her to make a choice and continue the war out of pride, and lose everything the Empire built, or accept what Jake offered months ago. Choose partnership instead of dominance. Jake stepped forward, and he spoke directly to Lyria, and he said that he did not want this war, and he said he would not let his people be treated as lesser beings, and if she was willing to start over and meet as equals, then humanity would gladly join hands with the Eldrath Empire. He said that humans had much to learn from Eldrath, ancient wisdom, and perhaps the Empire had something to learn from human determination and innovation, and he extended his hand in the human gesture of peace. Lyria looked at that hand for a long moment, and then at Azurath, and then back at Jake, and she felt the weight of empire and tradition and pride pressing down on her shoulders, but stronger was the weight of truth that she could no longer deny. She reached out and took his hand, and their fingers closed together, and human and Eldrath and equals and Azurath mental voice carried profound satisfaction, and the dragon said that wisdom had finally arrived. The peace negotiations began immediately, but they were not easy, and the Eldrath High Council resisted, and many were outraged that their princess had surrendered to humanity, and there were calls for her to be removed from succession, and for the war to continue under new leadership. But Lyria returned to the Empire changed, and Azurath's support carried enormous weight, and the dragon was ancient and respected, and when it spoke, the council had to listen, and slowly, painfully, the Empire began to accept reality. Lyria stood before the High Council, and she told them truths they did not want to hear, and she said that humanity matched the Empire in warfare, despite being centuries younger, and they proved resourceful and intelligent and unwilling to submit. She told them that humans showed mercy when they could have pressed their advantage, and the Starfire crown was returned undamaged as a gesture of good faith, and this spoke louder than any threats, and it showed that humans were not vindictive but principled. Elder Council member Theron argued against peace, and he said that accepting humans as equals would undermine the Empire authority, and that other species would question their supremacy. And Lyria agreed that yes, they would question it, and perhaps that was necessary. She said that the Empire had ruled through fear and superior technology for millennia, but that such rule was hollow and built on sand, and true strength came from alliances and cooperation and mutual respect, and the galaxy was changing, whether they liked it or not. Azurath appeared before the council, and this was rare, and the dragon seldom involved itself in politics. But now it spoke with authority, and it said that the Empire faced a choice, and adapt, and grow or stagnate, and eventually fall. And history was full of empires that refused to change. The dragon said that humanity was not going away, and they would continue to grow stronger and more capable, and the Empire could have them as friends or as eternal enemies, and the choice seemed obvious to any rational being. Slowly, votes began to shift, and council members who opposed peace started to reconsider, and they saw the casualty reports, and the economic costs, and the growing unrest among other species, and they realized that continuing the war might destroy the very empire they sought to protect. Finally, after weeks of debate, the council voted to accept peace terms, and the vote was not unanimous, but it was enough, and formal negotiations could begin, and both sides sent their best diplomats and worked toward an agreement. Captain Jake Morrison attended the final peace summit, and it was held on the same neutral station where everything began, and this time, when he walked into the diplomatic chamber, the atmosphere was completely different, and there was cautious respect instead of contempt. Princess Lyria stood before the assembled delegates from both civilizations, and Azurath rested beside her, and the dragon presence was a silent endorsement of what she was about to say, and everyone in the room understood the significance. Lyria spoke clearly, and her voice carried across the chamber, and she said that for 5,000 years, the Eldrath Empire stood as the dominant power in their region of space, and they believed their age and magic and wisdom made them superior to all others. She paused and then said that they were wrong, and murmurs rippled through the Eldrath delegation, and some looked shocked, and others looked relieved, and Lyria continued and said that humanity showed them that strength comes not from ancient power alone. She said that humanity demonstrated adaptability and determination and courage to stand for beliefs, and they fought the Empire to a standstill, and then offered peace, and they earned their place at the table not through submission but through excellence. Lyria turned to Jake, and her eyes met his, and she said that on behalf of the Eldrath Empire, she formally apologized for the insult that began this conflict, and she said that humans were not barbarians but equals, and she hoped they would accept the offer of alliance. Jake stood, and the entire room fell silent, and every eye was on him, and everyone waited to see how humanity would respond, and the moment stretched, and tension built, and then Jake smiled, and it was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in over a year. He said that he accepted the apology and he accepted the offer of alliance, but he had one condition, and the tension spiked again, and Lyria asked what condition, and Jake said that this alliance must be built on truth, not politics. He said no more assumptions about who was superior or inferior, and they would work together as partners and learn from each other and respect differences, and the moment either side started thinking they were better than the other, they would be back where they started. Lyria did not hesitate, and she said agreed, and they clasped hands again, and this time, it was before the entire gathered assembly, and cameras recorded the moment, and it would be shown across the galaxy, and the gesture was symbolic, but symbols mattered. This was how wars ended, and not with conquered territories or humbled enemies, but with respect, acknowledged and earned, and with former opponents choosing to become partners, and the room erupted in applause, and relief, and hope for a better future. Kate Sullivan smiled, and she had worked so hard for this moment, and she knew that she would become Earth's permanent ambassador to the Empire, and that there was much work ahead, but for now, she allowed herself to feel joy. A Zurath mental voice touched everyone in the room, and the dragon said that this was a new beginning, and that both civilizations would be stronger together than apart, and that the galaxy would benefit from their cooperation. The months following the peace agreement were challenging, and both civilizations had to overcome centuries of assumptions and prejudices, and learn to work together. And it was not easy. But slowly, progress was made, and trust began to build between humans and Eldrath. Kate Sullivan took her position as Earth Permanent Ambassador to the Eldrath Empire, and she worked closely with Princess Lyria to establish proper channels of communication and trade, and they met almost daily in the beginning, and discussed everything from cultural exchanges to technology sharing agreements. The first major project was a joint research station built in neutral space between human and Eldrath territories, and scientists from both civilizations worked side by side. And at first there was awkwardness and miscommunication, but gradually they found common ground and began making discoveries neither could have made alone. Human scientists were amazed by Eldrath's understanding of energy manipulation, and what they called magic was actually a sophisticated form of quantum field manipulation, and the Eldrath had been using it for millennia without fully understanding the underlying physics, and humans brought mathematical models that helped explain the mechanisms. Eldrath researchers were equally impressed by human innovation and adaptability, and humans approached problems from unexpected angles and were not bound by traditional thinking, and they experimented freely and failed often, but learned from each failure, and this approach was foreign to the more conservative Eldrath culture. Princess Lyria visited Earth for the first time 6 months after the peace treaty, and she arrived with a small delegation, and Azurath came too, and the dragon presence in Earth's skies caused quite a stir, and millions of people watched as the great creature circled above the capital. Jake Morrison met them at the landing site, and he wore his dress uniform, and there was a formal ceremony with speeches and photo opportunities, and both sides were careful to show respect and cooperation, and the images were broadcast across human space and the Eldrath Empire. After the ceremony, Lyria asked Jake if he would show her around Earth, and she wanted to understand humanity better and see where they came from, and Jake agreed, and they spent 3 days traveling to different locations, and Azurath flew overhead keeping watch. They visited the ruins of ancient human civilizations, and Lyria walked through stone temples and marble columns, and she realized that humans had been building and creating and dreaming for thousands of years, and their history was rich, even if their spacefaring era was short. Jake took her to a museum that displayed human art and music and literature through the ages, and Lyria stood before paintings and sculptures and felt emotions she did not expect, and she saw beauty and pain and hope and struggle, and she understood that humans were not primitive in the ways that mattered. They went to a simple restaurant in a small town and ate local food and talked without the pressure of politics or diplomacy. And Lyria asked Jake about his life and how he became a soldier. And he told her stories of growing up on Mars colony and of joining the military to protect his family. She asked about the wars he fought before meeting the Eldrath, and Jake was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had seen too much death and too much waste, and that he fought because someone had to, but he never enjoyed it, and he always hoped for peace. Lyria said that she understood now why he walked away from her insult, and Jake nodded, and he said that he learned long ago that some battles cannot be won by fighting, and that sometimes the strongest response was to refuse the fight entirely and let actions speak instead of words. She asked if he hated her for starting the war, and Jake looked at her seriously, and he said no, and he said that she was young and raised to believe certain things, and that changing deeply held beliefs was difficult, and he said that what mattered now was moving forward, not dwelling on past mistakes. Azurath joined them that evening, and the dragon landed in an open field, and its massive form settled onto the grass, and Lyria and Jake sat nearby and watched the sunset, and the dragon mental voice was gentle and contemplative. The dragon said that it had watched countless civilizations rise and fall, and the ones that survived were those that could adapt and change and accept new ideas, and the ones that failed were those that clung too tightly to old ways and refused to grow. Azurath said that both humanity and the Eldrath Empire had lessons to teach each other, and that together they could become something greater than either was alone. And the dragon said it was honored to witness this new alliance taking shape. Back in Eldrath space there were challenges too, and not everyone accepted the peace, and some military officers resigned rather than serve alongside humans. And there were protests in some cities, and angry speeches about surrendering to barbarians. But Princess Lyria addressed these concerns directly, and she traveled to different Eldrath worlds and spoke to crowds and explained what she learned, and she admitted her mistakes and asked her people to give humanity a chance, and slowly, attitudes began to shift. She brought human guests to speak at Eldrath universities, and scientists and artists and engineers, and they shared their knowledge and perspectives, and Eldrath students asked questions and debated and learned, and many were surprised by how much they had in common with these aliens. Trade agreements were finalized, and human colonies began receiving Eldrath technology and help with terraforming and energy production. And in return, humans shared their manufacturing techniques and agricultural innovations and medical advances. The economic benefits of cooperation became obvious quickly, and both civilizations prospered, and new jobs were created, and standards of living improved, and even the skeptics had to admit that the alliance was working better than anyone expected. Cultural exchanges brought young Eldrath to Earth universities, and human students went to study in Eldrath academies, and they lived together and learned together, and friendships formed that crossed species lines, and these personal connections strengthened the alliance more than any treaty could. Jake Morrison continued his military career, but his role changed, and instead of fighting wars, he now helped train combined human Eldrath defense forces, and the goal was to create units that could work together seamlessly and protect both civilizations from external threats. He worked closely with Eldrath military commanders and taught them human tactics, and learned Eldrath strategies in return, and there was mutual respect and professional admiration, and the old enemies became comrades and eventually friends. Lisa Hayes commanded the first joint military exercise, and it was a simulated battle against a hypothetical alien invasion, and human and Eldrath ships worked together, and the exercise revealed some coordination problems, but overall, it was successful, and both sides learned valuable lessons. Azurath became an unofficial guardian of the alliance, and the dragon traveled between human and Eldrath space, and helped resolve disputes before they escalated, and when tensions rose, the dragon ancient wisdom and neutral perspective helped find compromise. There was an incident when a human trading ship accidentally violated Eldrath sacred space, and the crew did not know it was forbidden, and some Eldrath wanted severe punishment, but Azurath intervened and explained it was an honest mistake, and helped negotiate an apology and restitution. Another time, Eldrath colonists and human settlers claimed the same planet, and both sides had legal arguments, and neither would back down, and Azurath suggested dividing the planet with each group, taking different continents, and establishing a joint governing council, and both sides agreed. Princess Lyria found herself changing in ways she did not expect, and working with humans taught her to question assumptions and think creatively, and she became a better leader, and her people noticed and respected her growth. She and Kate Sullivan became genuine friends, and they met regularly and talked about everything from politics to personal lives, and Kate told Lyria about Earth history and human struggles, and Lyria shared Eldrath philosophy and ancient wisdom. One evening, Kate asked Lyria what she thought about when she looked back at the first meeting with Jake, and Lyria was quiet, and then she said she thought about how close they came to disaster, and how her pride almost destroyed everything. She said that she was grateful Jake had the wisdom to walk away, and that his silence spoke louder than any argument could have, and that it forced her to confront her own prejudices, and that, painful as it was, the war taught her necessary lessons. Kate said that many humans were angry at first. When Jake walked away and thought he was giving up, but he understood something others did not. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to fight on your enemy terms and create your own path instead. Lyria asked Kate what she thought humanity's greatest strength was, and Kate thought about it and said it was probably hope, and she said that humans had faced extinction multiple times, and wars and plagues and disasters, and yet they always believed tomorrow could be better. She said that this hope drove humans to explore and create and build and dream, and even when logic said something was impossible, humans tried anyway, and sometimes they succeeded, and that stubborn optimism was both their weakness and their power. Lyria said that the Eldrath had lost some of that hope over the millennia, and they became comfortable and complacent, and forgot what it was like to strive for something new. And she said that learning from humanity was helping her people rediscover their own sense of purpose and possibility. The alliance continued to strengthen, and more joint projects were announced, and a combined exploration fleet was being built to venture into unknown regions of space, and human and Eldrath crews would work together to discover new worlds and new civilizations. Universities established exchange programs and research partnerships, and art galleries displayed works from both cultures side by side, and musicians collaborated on pieces that blended human and Eldrath styles, and the result was something beautiful and unique. Children from both species grew up learning about each other, and schools taught Eldrath language and human history, and young people who had never known the war saw each other as allies and friends, and this new generation would carry the alliance into the future. Jake Morrison stood at his office window one evening and looked up at the stars and thought about how much had changed in just a few years, and how a single moment of walking away had led to all this, and he wondered what would have happened if he had stayed and argued. He knew that some paths were meant to be walked, and that fate, or chance, or whatever one called it, had brought him and Lyria together at that moment and given them both a choice. And they made their choices, and the galaxy was better for it. Lisa Hayes joined him, and she followed his gaze to the stars and asked what he was thinking, and Jake smiled and said he was thinking about possibilities and about how the future looked brighter than he had dared to hope. 5 years passed since the peace treaty was signed, and the alliance between humanity and the Eldrath Empire had transformed both civilizations in ways no one could have predicted, and what began as a reluctant partnership had evolved into genuine cooperation and friendship. The combined exploration fleet that was planned years ago had finally launched, and it consisted of 20 ships, and half were human designs and half were Eldrath, and the crews were mixed, with officers and specialists from both species working together seamlessly. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the flagship Unity and watched as the fleet prepared to jump into unexplored space, and beside him stood Princess Lyria, who had insisted on joining the expedition, and Azurath was aboard too, and the dragon, ancient presence, gave everyone confidence. The mission was ambitious, and they would explore a region of space beyond both human and Eldrath territories, and search for new worlds and resources and possibly new civilizations, and it was the kind of venture that required trust and cooperation, and both species were ready. Jake gave the order, and the fleet jumped, and reality twisted around them, and when they emerged, they found themselves in a star system unlike any they had seen before, and the central star pulsed with strange energy, and 3 planets orbited in perfect synchronization. Exploration teams launched, and they discovered that the second planet was habitable and covered in lush forests and vast oceans, and initial scans showed no signs of intelligent life, but there were ruins and ancient structures that suggested someone had lived there long ago. Lyria led the first landing party, and Jake went with her along with scientists from both species, and they set foot on the planet's surface, and the air was breathable, and the temperature pleasant, and the ruins in the distance called to them with mystery. Azurath flew overhead, and the dragon's senses reached out, and the creature reported feeling echoes of old power and magic, and something about this place reminded the dragon of ancient Eldrath history, but different and older somehow. They explored the ruins for days, and found structures built with technology that neither humans nor Eldrath could fully understand, and there were chambers with walls covered in symbols and equations, and artistic designs that suggested a sophisticated culture. One chamber held what appeared to be a library, and crystalline data storage devices lined the walls, and when the Eldrath specialists activated one, the crystal projected images and sounds, and told the story of the civilization that once lived here. The people called themselves the Vareen, and they had thrived for thousands of years and achieved harmony between technology and nature, and built a society based on knowledge sharing and mutual respect. And they explored the stars peacefully and made contact with many species. But something happened and the records became fragmented, and there were references to a great threat and a decision to leave, and the Varine had abandoned their homeworld and scattered across the galaxy, and their fate was unknown. The human archaeologist named Dr. Amy Foster studied the records carefully, and she said that the Varine story had lessons for both humans and Eldrath, and they showed that even advanced civilizations faced challenges, and that survival required adaptation and sometimes sacrifice. Lyria stood before a massive mural that depicted the Varine at their height, and she saw individuals of different species working together, and she realized that the Varine had built an alliance even greater than what humans and Eldrath achieved. She said that perhaps this was meant to be found, and that the Varine left these records as a message to whoever came after. And the message was that cooperation was not weakness, but strength, and that diversity made civilizations stronger, not weaker. Jake agreed, and he said that the Varine gave them a gift and proof that their alliance was not unique, but part of a larger pattern, and that throughout history the civilizations that succeeded were those that opened their arms to others, instead of closing their fists. The exploration continued, and the fleet discovered more planets, and some had resources that both civilizations needed, and others had dangerous environments that required careful study, and every discovery strengthened the bond between humans and Eldrath. There was an incident on the fourth planet they explored, and a human research team became trapped in a cave system, and Eldrath rescue specialists used their magic to locate them and teleport them to safety, and the humans were grateful, and the Eldrath were glad to help. Another time, an Eldrath ship suffered engine failure and drifted toward a dangerous asteroid field, and human engineers worked tirelessly to repair the damage and towed the ship to safety, and the Eldrath crew thanked them profusely and spoke of the debt they owed. These small moments of helping each other built trust more effectively than any diplomatic agreement, and the crews began to see themselves not as humans and Eldrath but as one team with a common purpose. Back in their home territories, the Alliance continued to flourish, and the Joint Research Station had made breakthrough discoveries in energy production and medical treatments, and these innovations benefited billions of people from both civilizations. Trade had increased tenfold, and prosperity was widespread, and unemployment fell and new industries emerged, and the economic integration was so complete that separating the two economies would have been nearly impossible. Cultural integration was happening too, and human music played on Eldrath radio, and Eldrath art hung in human museums and restaurants, served fusion cuisine that blended flavors from both cultures and interspecies. Friendships were common. There were even a few marriages between humans and Eldrath, and while the biology made reproduction impossible, the couples loved each other and built lives together, and society accepted them and celebrated their unions. Kate Sullivan had become more than an ambassador, and she was now a senior advisor to both the human government and the Eldrath High Council. And she traveled constantly between Earth and the Eldrath homeworld, and worked on policies that affected both civilizations. She met regularly with Princess Lyria, and they had become so close that they considered each other sisters, and they shared everything, and supported each other through challenges, and celebrated successes together. One evening, Kate asked Lyria if she ever regretted how things started and if she wished the first meeting had gone differently, and Lyria thought carefully before answering. She said that she regretted the pain and death that the war caused, and she regretted her arrogance and pride, but she did not regret the journey, because it taught her invaluable lessons and made her who she was, and without that difficult beginning, the alliance might not be as strong. Kate said that Jake had told her something similar, and he said that easy paths rarely led to meaningful destinations, and that struggle and challenge were necessary for growth, and that the war forced both civilizations to confront their flaws and become better. Lyria asked about Jake and how he was doing, and Kate smiled and said he was happy, and he had found peace after so many years of war, and he still served, but now he built things instead of destroying them, and that suited him better. The exploration fleet returned to known space after 6 months, and they brought back data and samples and stories of what they found, and the Varine ruins especially captured public imagination and sparked interest in archaeology and ancient history. Plans were made for a permanent research outpost on the Varine homeworld, and scholars from both civilizations would study the ruins and try to learn what happened to that ancient people and perhaps find them if they still existed somewhere. Princess Lyria proposed a new initiative, and she wanted to create a council that included not just humans and Eldrath, but other species too. And she said the alliance should expand and welcome all who shared their values of cooperation and respect. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and several alien civilizations had been watching the human-Eldrath alliance with interest, and some had already made diplomatic overtures and expressing desire to join. Jake supported the expansion but cautioned that they should move carefully and learn from mistakes, and ensure that new members truly shared their commitment to equality and partnership. A conference was organized and representatives from 15 different species attended, and they discussed forming a larger alliance. And the debates were intense but productive, and by the end, agreements were reached. The new organization was called the Galactic Cooperative, and its charter emphasized mutual respect and shared prosperity and peaceful resolution of conflicts and protection of individual rights, and every member had equal voice regardless of size or power. Humanity and the Eldrath Empire were founding members, and they provided leadership and guidance, but they made clear that no species was superior to any other, and decisions would be made collectively. Azurath attended the founding ceremony, and the dragon spoke to all assembled delegates and said that this was a moment of historic importance, and that the cooperative had potential to reshape the galaxy for the better. The dragon said that it had lived long enough to see patterns, and that civilizations that isolated themselves eventually stagnated and fell, but those that engaged with others, and learned and adapted thrived, and grew stronger. Azurath said that the human-Eldrath alliance proved what was possible when former enemies chose to become friends, and that this example inspired others, and showed that change was always possible if people had courage and wisdom. Princess Lyria stood before the assembly and gave a speech that moved many to tears, and she spoke of her journey from arrogant young royal to leader who understood the value of humility and cooperation. She talked about the insult she gave Jake Morrison, and how he responded not with anger but with quiet dignity, and how that single moment changed everything. And she said that she would be forever grateful for his wisdom. She said that every person in the room had the power to choose peace over conflict, and understanding over prejudice, and cooperation over domination, and these choices shaped the future, and they should choose wisely. Jake Morrison was asked to speak, and he was reluctant, but finally agreed, and he stood before hundreds of alien delegates, and spoke simply and from the heart. He said that humanity came to the stars with hope and dreams, and also with fear and uncertainty, and they met the Eldrath and learned that the galaxy was bigger and more complex than they imagined. He said that the war taught them lessons they would never forget, and that peace was precious and hard-won and must be protected, and that differences between species were not obstacles, but opportunities to learn and grow. He said that he walked away from that first meeting because he believed in humanity worth, and he would not beg for acceptance. And he said that every species in the room should have that same pride and dignity. But he also said that pride without wisdom was destructive, and that true strength came from knowing when to stand firm and when to extend a hand in friendship, and he hoped the cooperative would embody both strength and compassion. The assembly applauded, and the Galactic Cooperative was officially founded, and a new era began, and species that had never spoken before now worked together, and the galaxy became more connected and more peaceful. Years passed, and the cooperative grew, and trade flourished, and scientific discoveries accelerated, and conflicts that might have led to war were resolved through dialogue and arbitration. Jake Morrison retired from active military service, and he took a teaching position and trained the next generation of leaders and officers, and he shared his experiences and wisdom, and emphasized the importance of seeing former enemies as potential friends. Princess Lyria became High Chancellor of the Eldrath Empire, and she led her people with grace and vision, and under her guidance, the Empire transformed from an isolated power into an engaged member of the galactic community. Kate Sullivan continued her diplomatic work and helped integrate new species into the cooperative, and she was known throughout the galaxy as a bridge builder and peacemaker. Azurath grew more contemplative with age, and the dragon spent time on quiet worlds and reflected on the changes it had witnessed, and sometimes young people from various species came to seek the dragon wisdom, and Azurath taught them what it had learned. One evening, Jake sat on a terrace overlooking the ocean, and Lyria joined him, and they watched the sunset together, as they had done many times over the years, and they talked about the journey they had shared. Lyria said that she often thought about that first meeting and wondered what would have happened if Jake had not walked away, and if he had argued or gotten angry. Jake said that the galaxy would be a very different place, and probably worse, and he said that walking away was the hardest thing he had ever done, but also the most important. He said that it taught him that sometimes the best action was no action, and that silence could be more powerful than words, and that giving people time and space to realize their mistakes was better than forcing confrontation. Lyria said that his silence gave her time to think, and to see herself clearly, and to understand that her beliefs were based on assumptions rather than truth, and she said that if he had argued she would have dismissed him, but his departure made her question everything. They sat in comfortable silence and watched stars appear in the darkening sky, and each star represented a world and possibilities, and the future stretched before them full of promise. Jake said that he was proud of what they built, and that the alliance and the cooperative exceeded his hopes, and that future generations would inherit a better galaxy because of the choices they made. Lyria agreed, and she said that the young alien princess who insulted the human was gone, and in her place was someone wiser and humbler and grateful for the lessons life taught her. She said that the human who turned away without saying a word had given her the greatest gift, and the gift of perspective, and the chance to grow and become better. They raised their glasses and toasted to the future and to friendship, and to the continuing journey, and above them stars shone bright and full of infinite possibilities.